Good evening, everybody. We're going to get started here in just a second, allowing people to get into the room. Well, good evening. My name is Reg Hoyt. I am the co-chair of Animal Biotechnology and Conservation, and also chair of Del Val's One Health Working Group. And it's my pleasure to, be introducing you to One Health and then introducing you to some of the folks that we have on our panel here. And they, in turn, will introduce our speaker for this evening. It's our third One Health seminar of the season. I really appreciate you being here. I hope that you're going to really enjoy this presentation. I want to tell you a little bit about One Health. I think that the vast majority of you have probably heard from me on multiple occasions about what One Health is. There's a definition down there at the bottom of the slide, but I think it's a lot easier than that. I think simply everything is about One Health. We've only got one planet. We're all on this planet together with plants, animals. We interact with them, we interact with our environment, and in turn, they have impacts upon us. And so I've said earlier today that I see One Health as being a celebration of that connectedness, but along with it comes responsibility. And so that, it's good for us to be aware that we're part of this system, but we also have to be aware that our actions, our community's actions, our state, our country, the whole world's interaction with these have impacts, whether they're positive or negative. And it's up to us to make good decisions in regards to that. Here at Del Val, we're doing something a wee bit different from what you might see elsewhere, in that we've actually introduced a One Health concept to the entire campus. Our students have courses their first year in which they're introduced to the concept of One Health, and hopefully there are some freshmen that are on this particular seminar tonight. We certainly would encourage student research to include multiple departments. We're a small university, and the silos, well, they're there, but they're pretty short. And so it'd be good for people across disciplines to come together and really live One Health through a student research project. And then the other component of this is outreach. And the seminar series is just that. It's part of outreach. It's our intent to reach our entire campus community, but also beyond our community to those folks that live in our area and perhaps even people across the country. And that leads me to our co-sponsors this evening. We are so lucky to have Bill with us this evening. He is the president of Heritage Conservancy. Going to tell you a little bit about the Conservancy, and then we'll be introducing our guest this evening, and Helen Toomey. All yours, Bill.
Thank you very much, Reg, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this session. I'm joined by my colleague, Shannon Friedebois-Siller, who is our Director of Education Programs. I'm the president of Heritage Conservancy, and we are a community-based organization that protects land from development, restores habitat, and shares education and nature programs with our community. We're based in Doylestown in Bucks County, neighbors to all of you at Del Val. To date, we have protected about 17,000 acres of natural land and open space. So I think we've made an impact on this area for all the constituencies that are part of the One Health community that Reg described. And through our school-based education and community programs, we connect over 5,000 people each year with their local environment. If you're interested in joining our efforts at Heritage Conservancy through membership, volunteering, programs, or other activities, please visit our website and sign up for our newsletter. You can use the QR code that's on the screen or go to heritageconservancy.org. So why am I speaking to you this evening? As a science-based land conservation organization, it's vital to our mission to have science understood and accepted as a basis for decision-making. For example, throughout much of our work, we seek to promote climate action. There are actually very important connections between land conservation and climate mitigation and adaptation. And we struggle with the reality that facts and logical explanation about climate change do not always, or perhaps rarely, carry the day. So that's why I'm particularly pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Helen Toomey, or is it Toomey?
Toomey.
In any case, Associate Professor of Environmental Studies and Science at Pace University in New York City. Professor Toomey earned her PhD in Human Geography from Lancaster University in England. In addition to her primary position at Pace University, she's an affiliate researcher at the Center for Science Communication Research at the University of Oregon and at the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. In 2024, she published the award-winning book, Science with Impact: How to Engage People, Change Practice, and Influence Policy, which explores how research can meaningfully inform decision-making and drive societal change. In her work, she tries to unpack why facts, in air quotes, mean different things to different people and how science-based attitudes and behaviors can spread. She hopes to help scientists think more carefully about the research choices they make even before collecting data. And she wants scientists to help alleviate public distrust, communicate about their uncertainty, and engage with policymakers for real-world impact. Professor, welcome, and over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just load up my slides here. All right, there we go. Thanks for the introduction. That was really great. And it was especially great to see how you foregrounded this talk in One Health, because I'm going to be sharing some stories that come from the medical field, the environmental field. So I think hopefully we'll be able to get into that One Health as well. All right, so to start, just to introduce myself a little bit. So my name's Ann Toomey. I'm an associate professor of environmental studies at Pace University, and I'm based in New York City. And today I'm really going to talk about science with impact and why facts don't change minds and what does. So just to explain a little bit about myself, I like to call myself an environmental social scientist. So I study human attitudes and behaviors related to the environment and science, and really how to make science more useful for society. And beyond being a social scientist, I am also a social science communicator. So many of you may have heard of science communicators, right, who communicate the importance of science and scientific thinking. But my goal is also to communicate social science thinking and ideas, which are really all about understanding the human side of the world. So I'd like to start with just acknowledging something that's likely on all our minds, right? Which are the current challenges facing the scientific, environmental, and medical communities in this country today. This situation isn't theoretical. It's affecting our work in very real ways, from the research we're doing and can do, to real-world environmental and health outcomes for communities across the country, and arguably the world. So what can we do? How can we best respond? Is it possible to shift the tide in a different direction? And I'm starting this talk from a place that yes, it is. But I think the answer isn't simply repeating the facts. Rather, the solution requires that scientists and students of science develop a deeper understanding of social science and how humans perceive scientific information and act on this information. And so that's what I'm going to focus on today. So for this talk, I'll be telling 3 stories. The first story is about an island off the east coast of the United States that's threatened with sea level rise, but where the inhabitants largely don't believe in climate change. And we'll explore this case study to have a better understanding of how factual information is processed in the brain and why we as humans, all of us, have trouble accommodating new information that challenges pre-existing beliefs. The second story comes to us from India, and it's a terrific success story of how civil society was mobilized to eradicate polio. And here we'll explore network science and how behavior spreads and leads to social change. And the third story is how a professor of entomology and a student helped to change farming practice and policy in rural Pennsylvania. And finally, I'll just end with some take-home examples with some, take-home messages with some additional examples of how you can do effective science communication, different approaches around the world. So first, just to talk about Tangier. So Tangier Island is off the eastern coast of the United States, and it's rapidly disappearing due to sea level rise. Scientists predict the island will be uninhabitable within the next few decades. And if this happens, the residents of Tangier will be among the first climate refugees in the United States, which is a label more commonly associated with island communities in the South Pacific. However, unlike many island communities, the residents of Tangier have not been spokespeople for climate action. To the contrary, many of the residents of Tangier contest the idea of human-caused climate change and sea level rise and think that it is, if not quite a hoax, a distraction from the real issue of God-made erosion. So to illustrate this, I'm going to show you this short clip.
You see this island here? This wasn't an island. This was all connected. So you can see within a year's time how much land disappeared.
Do you think it's because the sea level was rising?
No, it's because of erosion.
A tiny speck in Chesapeake Bay, Tangier is home to a small and very religious community of hardy crabbers. Tangier is rapidly disappearing into the Chesapeake because of sea level rise.
Erosion of sea level rise.
No, sea level rise caused by global warming.
That's the biggest hoax ever was.
No!
Climate change is real.
No way, honey. It never changed my mind.
So how can people in the front line of sea level rise not believe in climate change? And to illustrate what I mean, I have a bit of an interactive activity, although I'm not 100% sure that you can all use the chat, but we'll try it. So what can you see? Who sees blue and black and who sees gold and white? And if you're able, please do post in the chat. We'll see if it works. So I'm not seeing anything in the chat, so I'm guessing that's not going to work. All right, well, usually what happens is about half the audience sees blue and black and the other half sees gold and white. So I'm going to assume that that is what's happening here. So how is it possible that we see different colors? And what's happening is that the picture was so overexposed that it essentially forces our brains to make assumptions about the lighting conditions in which the photo was taken. Our perceptions of color are informed by our perceptions of lighting. So those of us whose brains assume the picture was taken under natural lighting, possibly outside, see as white and gold. And those whose brains assumed it was taken under artificial lighting, so possibly indoors, see it as blue and black. But why would our brains assume different lighting conditions? Researchers surveyed 13,000 people about the dress and found the main difference between the blue-black people and the white-gold people was how much time in their life they had spent exposed to natural light. Those who had worked more outside or near windows, so morning people maybe, or sometimes actually older people, when I did this with retirees, I found that almost all the retirees saw the dress as gold and white, as compared to when I did it with my my undergraduates in New York City, and almost all of them saw it as blue and black, which I thought was really interesting. So those who spent, like I said, more time outside near windows were more likely to see the dress as having been illuminated by natural light, which then leads the image to look more yellow. So in other words, our brains quite literally see the dress as being a different color based on our prior life experiences. And this process is completely out of our control. For example, even though I now know that the actual color of the dress was blue and black when the photo was taken, I still see it as white and gold. And David McRaney wrote this great book called How Minds Change, and he uses the example of the dress to explain why our tendency to interpret the same information differently is also why we disagree so much, and why such disagreements often seem to happen across different social identities, such as political ideologies. He writes, unaware of the disprocessing that leads to such disagreement, it will feel like a battle over reality of itself, over the truth of our own eyes. Disagreements like these often turn into disagreements between groups because people with broadly similar experiences and motivations tend to disambiguate in broadly similar ways. And whether they find one another online or in person, the fact that trusted peers see things their way can feel like all the proof they need. They are right and the other side is wrong, factually, morally, or otherwise. Because of this, information that challenges our pre-existing worldviews or social identities can feel threatening and even offensive. If we read a weather report, we're unlikely to question the science behind that. Although, to be honest, sometimes if I don't like the first weather report I see, I find myself checking for a different weather report. But if we read a study pointing to the impacts of a ban on assault rifles, depending on how we feel about an issue, we may be inclined to question those facts if they challenge our pre-existing beliefs. So where do beliefs come from? Well, as researchers have found, beliefs come from our experiences. And these come from our environments and our social communities, our family, our neighborhood, our religion, our education, our personality, personal experiences, etc. These influences shape our most fundamental beliefs about the world without our realizing it. Similar to a fish swimming in water, we often don't think about the water too much. We think we're the master of our destinies, but we're largely shaped by our environments. This is why we're often unaware of racial, gender, or age-related biases. They exist within our communities and our environments, and they're like the water we're swimming in without noticing how they affect us. And sometimes facts can even make things worse. Well, why would this be? Well, frankly, they make us mad. We can sense when someone is trying to persuade us and it generates negative feelings. As in the video, you could see that the man was getting angry with the reporter for insisting that climate change is real. Information that challenges our pre-existing worldviews triggers negative emotions. And the more complex and stressful the information, the more likely it is to be processed in parts of the brain, such as the insula or the amygdala, which are more associated with emotions like fear or pleasure, rather than in the prefrontal cortex, which is more associated with rational thinking and deliberation. Because of this, we actively resist ideas we disagree with. In a 1967 study, researchers had undergraduates listen to some pre-recorded speeches about various controversial topics, which at the time smoking was quite controversial, religion as well. And these speeches were full of static and so hard to hear. But the participants could press a button to reduce the static if they wanted to get a clearer listen. The researchers found that the students who smoked were very eager to tune into the speech that suggested cigarettes might not cause cancer, whereas non-smokers were more likely to slam on the button for the anti-smoking speech. So in other words, we'll make an effort to tune into messages that we agree with, but we're happy to not hear those that we dislike. And often we might think that more education is the answer, but actually the science has really questioned this. And in fact, some studies have shown that the more educated people are, the more likely they are to be skeptical of a fact if it goes against their pre-existing beliefs. So for example, studies of smokers in the 1960s found that the most educated smokers were often also those who were the most skeptical of the evidence that linked cancer and smoking. And more recent studies have found similar findings. So for issues strongly tied to political or religious identity, like evolution or climate change, the more educated individuals and also those who have greater scientific literacy tend to filter their understanding of the issue through their prior belief system. So why would this be? Well, you can think about it. If you're educated and motivated, it's like psychologically motivated, you can more easily rationalize arguments that support what you want to think. And there's this great book, The Enigma of Reason, that really goes into the social science of understanding why we reason. And we often think we reason to make logical decisions, but actually what they found is that we really reason to justify socially to others why we have made the decision that we've made. So we like to think of ourselves as logical creatures, but we're really not. Why are we like this? Well, we're evolved to be so. Social bonding is how we thrive as a species, and so we tend to adopt the beliefs of our community. And also research has found that while winning an argument triggers feel-good hormones such as dopamine and adrenaline, When our beliefs are threatened, we release cortisol, which is a hormone that's associated with stress and the fight or flight response. So frankly, it feels bad and is risky to go against our pre-existing beliefs. Back to Tangier. Similar to the dress, the residents also saw things differently. For decades, they'd been trying to raise awareness about the increasing rate of land loss to the sea, and had even been doing measurements of their own since the 1950s, calculating the loss of land from the ocean long before the scientists arrived to talk about climate change. Erosion was the enemy they knew, something they had dealt with their entire lives, that their parents and grandparents had dealt with, and something that could be addressed in the future potentially. Whereas climate change was something from the outside, something that seemed to suggest a complete end to their island and their way of living. You can stop erosion in theory, right? But you can't stop sea level rise. So basically, the islanders were not willing to go down without a fight. And here's a photo of a t-shirt that you can actually buy on the island. It reads, "I refuse to be a climate change refugee." Furthermore, there was an issue of lack of trust. The residents had a long and frustrating history trying to work with scientists and government officials to bring actionable solutions to address the loss of land. As quoted in Earl Swift's ethnography about Tangier, the mayor said, "They do studies and then they study the studies. I know that's their procedure, but it gets frustrating. We're at the point now that it's like me coming across a family in a boat that's sinking, and I say, I'm going to rescue you, but I have to study it first." This gets into the role of trust. Why would we trust scientists and scientific information? And explain this, I just have a reflection activity. So just take a moment and think about the following question. Does the Earth revolve around the sun, or does the sun revolve around the Earth? So assuming that we're all in agreement here, right, or most of us are, that the Earth revolves around the sun, just take a moment and think about how would you explain this to someone else? How would you explain the mechanics of it, how you know? And I don't think we can post in the chat, but that's okay. Just take a moment. So generally when I ask people to do this, especially in a setting where you can speak with the person next to you, everyone kind of looks and laughs because they think this is actually harder than I thought it would be. And why is this so hard? Well, basically because it's telling the difference between the Earth orbiting the sun and the sun versus the other way around it's not really easily perceptible to the human eye or experience. So we would have to understand things that are really complicated, way more complicated than me as a social scientist can explain, but something like the stellar parallax, and perhaps need telescopes, right, that can enable us to view the motions of the moons of Jupiter, really to understand this in an empirical way. Like it's not that easy to explain, right? And that's why for so many years, for so much of human history, we believed that the sun went around the Earth. So we think we believe things because we know them, but the truth is that most of the time we're just relying on the knowledge of others in our communities. We know now, all of us, that this Earth revolves around the sun because of Galileo, but also mainly because of our science teachers in high school. And our science teachers also probably didn't do any of those calculations on their own. The world is extremely complex, and so the way we make sense of it is to rely on what our intuition, the world around us, and other people tell us to be true. We're hugely influenced by others in our social networks, and this is both the key to our success as a species, and it's also why facts are culturally debated. So if facts don't necessarily change minds, then what can work? And here I'll take us into our second story, which comes from India. So this was the issue. Polio was a highly infectious disease that at its peak in the 1950s killed approximately 500,000 people worldwide each year, paralyzing millions more. As recently as 2009, India was considered the polio epicenter of the world and had half of the world's cases. Many believed India would never be completely rid of the disease due to a multitude of reasons, but especially vaccine skepticism, which was concentrated among hard-to-reach groups in underserved parts of the country. But incredibly, the last case of polio was identified in India in 2011. And by 2014, the country had completely eradicated the disease. So India went from having half of the world's cases to just one case in under 2 years. So I'll just repeat this. How did India go from having half of the world's cases to just one case in under 2 years? And to understand this, first we need to understand something about how behavior spreads. So we often think about social norms or something that's changing, whether we're talking about the uptake of vaccines or social behaviors like recycling, as spreading in the way that a virus does. But whereas simple information, such as like a job advertisement, maybe posted on LinkedIn, can spread like a virus, like a meme, researchers have found this does not apply to complex ideas or calls for behavioral or societal change. And this is because if someone shares something that's geared towards changing our minds or behaviors about something of importance, there will always be a degree of resistance that needs to be addressed. And this is where complex contagions apply. So complex contagions require social confirmation, and this in turn requires two intersecting ingredients. First, direct personal relationships with someone who has already taken on the new belief or behavior. And second, redundancy. So you need to hear about the behavior or idea from multiple sources. So what does this mean? It means that people need to hear about the new idea from multiple others in their communities. And so how can this happen? So going back to polio, what they did was they engaged volunteers from within vaccine-resistant communities, including students, faith leaders, and teachers, to go on a listening campaign and become ambassadors for the vaccine. These volunteers were trained in interpersonal communication skills, and they met repeatedly with parents who were nervous about the vaccine, building trust and rapport through regular visits. Through this process, they began to understand the reasons for the vaccine hesitancy. And as described by one person, it's not a matter of hard to reach, but rather hardly reached. The communities had felt ignored by the government and were thus mistrusting and skeptical of government or NGO interventions during polio vaccination rounds. In addition, there were practical concerns. So, for example, it soon became clear that in the eyes of many poor residents, getting a child vaccinated could mean losing 1 or more days of work if the vaccination caused side effects like fever. Furthermore, polio was only one of many health concerns. And to address this concern, health camps were set up in highly resistant areas, and this convened medical personnel and provided free medication and vaccines on days organized in advance with community leaders. And this was hugely successful and led to increased trust among the communities and agencies. So the methods had both ingredients, direct personal communication and redundancy. And perhaps most notable about this achievement is that these interventions had a spillover effect, leading in some high-risk regions of the country to an increase in full routine immunization coverage. So for example, in one state, full coverage increased from 36% in 2009 to 81% in 2016. So what does this mean for communicating science on other topics and encouraging science-based behaviors? And here I'll mention the work of sociologist Anthony Giddens, who referred to personal interactions between experts, such as doctors or scientists, and lay people as access points, which he deemed essential for maintaining trust in modern institutions. Beyond just providing information, Giddens argued that such interactions provide opportunities for experts to share values and character traits, warmth, integrity, professionalism, that are essential for building trust. And this points to an opportunity for members of the scientific community, whether researchers, educators, communicators, even students of science, to serve as such access points by connecting in a direct and personal way with communities that have been underserved by science. And to illustrate these latter ideas, I'll talk about the third and final story, which was brought to my attention by farmers, actually, in central Pennsylvania, in a rural part of the United States. So in 2021, I went to this part of Pennsylvania to do interviews with farmers about their perceptions of science and scientists. And largely speaking, they felt quite negative about science. But a couple of them mentioned one pair of scientists who were very different, named John Tooker and Maggie Douglas. So farmers at that time all over the region were having slug issues. The farmers would talk with one another about possible treatments, call up the county extension offices for help, and go on websites like Ag Talk for advice. But no one seemed to have the answers. At the time, Tooker was new at his post at Penn State, which was 50% research and 50% extension. And soon his phone began to ring, and almost every call was about slugs. The farmers invited him to a breakfast and asked for his help, and he said he'd try. Although Tooker didn't study slugs, which are mollusks and not insects, one thing he did know as an entomologist was that if there was a pest issue, it was likely because something had happened to the pest predators. And based on this theory, John Tooker got his student Douglas set up with lab-based experiments, putting slugs in containers with known predators, such as carabid beetles and soybean seedlings, to see what happened. And this is when they made a startling discovery. The beetles were all dying. As it turned out, Douglas had unknowingly planted soybean seed that was coated with a particularly potent insecticide known as a neonicotinoid for her experiments. And as the seed sprouted and grew, the insecticide traveled into the roots and then the leaves of the seedling, and finally into the slug as it ate the plant. And while the chemical didn't seem to bother the slugs in the least, it was toxic to its predators, and upwards of 60% of the beetles were impaired after eating slugs infused with the pesticide. Tooker knew they had something important to share with the farmers, and when another field day came up, they had their opportunity. So they put together a PowerPoint presentation with videos embedded in the slides. Tooker remembered the moment when they played a video of one of the lab experiments which showed a beetle that was clearly dying from having been poisoned by the pesticide. He said, "I still remember the remarks and the gasps in the room of those farmers saying, 'Oh wow, holy cow.' It was clear evidence that something was messing up the beetles. And once they saw that video, the farmers just took it on faith that our data were related to that phenomena, that the reason we were finding fewer beetles in the fields was because of that." And here I'll mention another part of the story. So the seeds were treated with neonicotinoids, which are the most widely used class of insecticides in the world. Researchers found that neonicotinoids are toxic to some pollinator species, and thus they are banned across Europe. However, they continue to be permitted for use in much of the United States, pretty much all the United States, except for New York, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And indeed, in some places like Pennsylvania, it's hard to find seed that's not treated with these chemicals. For years, there have been so many efforts to try to get farmers to use fewer pesticides due to the impacts on pollinators. But doing so is a tough sell for several reasons, and one that corn is wind pollinated, and soybeans are largely self-pollinating, so whether bees were being harmed was not really among the top concerns for these types of farmers. But now this new research began to change that. Now planting neonicotinoid-treated seeds was not just bad for bees, it was also potentially bad for corn and soybean crops. However, even as the farmers began to understand the problem of using such seed, another problem remained, which was that there were hardly any untreated seed to be found. You couldn't really get it easily. Neonicotinoid-coated seeds dominated the corn and soybean markets, and farmers often didn't have a choice over what seeds they could buy for their land. And it was this lack of choice that got the attention of some policymakers, Tooker later told me. So after publishing in their work in a top journal in the field, they were invited to go to DC to meet with the staffers of both the Senate and the House Agricultural Committees. Tooker and Douglas prepared a one-pager, and they began talking about the problem of neonicotinoids, but immediately they could tell that the staffers were not very interested in the issue. Neonicotinoids were not a new topic, and the staffers' eyes began to glaze over as the researchers attempted to explain the issue. But then Douglas mentioned something about how the farmers didn't have a choice in seed selection, And one of the staffers sat straight up in his chair. They don't have a choice, he said. Well, that's a problem. And this pointed to a potential opening for change, something that years of lobbying from environmental groups to reduce pesticides used by farmers had not had much success with. While neonicotinoid-coated seeds are still standard for corn and most soybean, this is slowly changing as more non-coated seeds are made available for farmers to purchase. And states that border Pennsylvania, such as New York, have passed laws to ban the use of neonicotinoids, which would drastically change the planting landscape for farmers. So their research has been part of these conversations. And at some point, hopefully these conversations are going to start happening in Pennsylvania as well. And in the meantime, the number of farmers opting for integrated pest management approaches as opposed to conventional insecticides is growing. And I spoke to some of these farmers fairly recently, and they told me they'd entirely switched away from these coated seeds and away from pesticides more generally because of the research that John Tucker and Maggie Douglas had done. So perhaps I'll contradict myself here. Perhaps facts do change minds. The farmers adopted new techniques based on the research after all. They accepted the facts shown to them. But I like to think about the role of facts as follows. Facts are like the swimming pool that you willingly jump into in a hot summer day in your bathing suit. But if the water's cold or if you're not ready to jump in, you'll hop right out. And I think in a similar way, we must be psychologically and socially prepared for the introduction of facts that might challenge our worldview. Tucker said, if I had come up with those ideas on my own, but been less engaged with the farmers, I don't think it would have had the same outcome because maybe my motivations could have been questioned. Maybe I was anti-insecticide, maybe I was a tree hugger. You could have come up with a variety of reasons for why they wouldn't trust me. But why they did had a lot to do with the request and our willingness to act on that request. So what does this mean for doing science with impact, especially in these troubled times, and especially for early career researchers or students of science? And I think first, there are a few things we can learn from these stories. I think the first is that we can make people feel more at ease, listen to them, and build relationships. We can be Giddens access points, the flesh and blood connectors to the scientific enterprise. And I think this means starting with the concerns and interests of those we hope to influence with our research. So going from thinking about science communication, from giving facts to building shared knowledge through trust and dialogue. So instead of convincing, connecting. For example, there's a Canadian environmental organization called Neighbors United that uses a deep canvassing approach to have door-to-door conversations about climate change in the community of Trail in British Columbia, where many residents are employed by fossil fuel-based industries. And while we think of most canvassing approaches, people coming to the door to try to convince us to buy something, deep canvassing is different in that it's a true conversation. It involves listening to people's stories and sharing one's own stories about controversial topics. So while past attempts to convey the importance of climate action hadn't worked in this rural community, the deep canvassing approach actually led the community to voting to transition to 100% renewable energy by 2030. Another key point is that people learn from those around them. So to influence a community, we need to understand it and to communicate in ways that make sense to its members. Scientific evidence sticks best when it feels relevant to people's everyday lives. And most people trust science, actually. There's like some, a lot of news and press that say that people don't trust science, but actually that's not true. What is changing is that there's less trust and less confidence in scientists and in scientific institutions. So there's a difference, right, between trust in science and trust in scientific institutions. And in fact, most people in the United States can't name a single living scientist. And I think that's why it's so important to show the human side of science. So sharing our struggles and not just our successes. And so, for example, there was another study that I wanted to mention that exposed students to stories about science through different treatments. One shared stories about scientist struggles, one shared stories about their same scientist's lifetime achievements, and one only shared information about the scientific topics the students were studying. The researchers found that the stories about achievements did not result in any increases in students' interest in the content, recall of concepts, or improvement in the scores, and actually led to increased negative perceptions of scientists and science. In contrast, the stories about scientists struggling increased students' interest in science, increased their understanding of scientific concepts, improved their scientific problem solving, and furthermore led to them having more positive views of scientists. So the researchers concluded it wasn't necessarily just having increased awareness of scientists that improved perceptions. And in fact, knowing about more of the achievements strengthened pre-existing stereotypes about science. But rather, it was when the students were given opportunities to learn more about scientists' struggles, they were more likely to see scientists as ordinary people who encounter challenges and struggles in their scientific discoveries and just in their lives, right? They're just human. So if we wish more people to accept science, they need to feel that scientific knowledge is something that makes sense in their own communities. And I think to do this, we have to create opportunities for people to have more positive experiences with science. So beyond school, right? Many people don't engage with science beyond high school, and sometimes those experiences were not the best. But science can be made more participatory in many ways. So citizen science, mobile laboratories, experiential science education, etc. For example, sidewalk science is an approach that takes science education out of schools and museums and literally onto the streets. Scientists set up tables and experiments that people of all ages can engage with in real time. And it offers opportunities for people to ask questions. And these types of opportunities and experiences point to the importance of seeing the opportunities for people to have conversations about science as a fundamental human right. I think if people can begin to connect to science, this can have a spillover effect in other arenas. And I argue this is the main task for those of us who care about science, environmental, and health issues, to expand who can see themselves as being part of scientific and environmental communities. So in conclusion, I think we all have a role to play. And I'll share 2 quotes that are helping me navigate this current moment. The first is, we control nothing, but we influence everything. Many of us in the scientific and environmental communities might feel powerless right now in many ways. But we've always had the power to step out of our labs and offices to learn more about how our research can impact others. And the second quote is, if you think you're too small to have an impact, try to go to bed with a mosquito. We've always had the power to listen, to show care and concern, and to engage with communities that need us. And we still have that power. And I think now more than ever, we need to harness that power and channel it so we're not the only ones standing up for science. So thank you all so much. And I'd love to hear any questions or comments you might have. So thanks all.
Thank you so much. Everyone, please put your questions into the Q&A. I think we have a couple here that I'll read to you, Anne, and so you'll be able to focus on answering the questions. Both of these actually are from Christian. The first one is, have you ever gotten into a heated debate with somebody who doesn't think global warming is real?
So I haven't gotten into a debate about global warming specifically, but I did get into some heated debates during COVID. And I'll say this was before I wrote my book. I feel like I would have approached it a lot differently if I had actually done the research on how to have a good conversation. I think I actually threatened to forcibly vaccinate the person at the time. I don't recommend as a argumentative strategy. Yeah, I've really come to rethink many things about the way that I had those conversations. So I'll say what I've learned is the power of listening, because actually, people have very valid reasons for believing what they do, whether or not you agree with them or not. And just going to the example of, vaccine hesitancy, I think it's important to see people as not vaccine skeptics, but really vaccine hesitant. Like, and so many of us are on that spectrum. So, like it's like sometimes it just may be like delaying getting a flu vaccine and so it has to do with like so many different issues. So it could be like personal experiences that maybe you've had a bad reaction, maybe someone in your family's had a bad reaction, like understanding where people might be coming from, distrust of the health system, which is totally valid, right? I mean, like the health insurance system in this country is not ideal to say the least. So understanding that people are coming from their own worldviews, their own experiences, and trying to listen and understand that. And then because you're not going to convince someone who already has set their mind on something with just yelling facts at them, but you could maybe start to show them different experiences, your own way of thinking about something. And yeah, don't try to forcibly push anyone into a given position. It's not effective. I can say that from experience.
Well, Christian, I'm gonna jump down to give some other folks some questions and maybe we'll come back to your second one. But this one is from Jessica. Why do some people view scientific change as a threat to their identity or traditions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the particular issue. I think I like that example of Tangier Island because I think it really shows that, they had been doing measurements of the loss of land to the sea for over a half century. So it was something that they already knew was happening. But then when climate change really only came into the picture in like the last few decades, right? Maybe in like the late 1990s, and so it was this kind of new thing, like this new idea that actually it wasn't that they just needed to shore up their island with some jetties and maybe get like some hard edge, but actually they couldn't live there. It was this idea that, well, the sea is rising, so you're going to have to ultimately, like, there wasn't really a solution other than probably evacuating or knowing that there would be a complete loss to their identity, to their entire community. So you can understand why, in that perspective, why in that case people would be so resistant. And it was also coming from the opposite political party. I mean, if you look at like the main spokesperson for climate change in the early 2000s, before climate change was something that we're all talking about, was Al Gore. Al Gore ran for the Democratic ticket. He was running for president. And so if you were a conservative, if you didn't like the Democrats, and then this this person that had run for the Democratic Party hadn't got elected and now was going on this world tour to talk about climate change, you could see why people would be kind of skeptical of that. I don't think he was a great messenger. I think he was a good messenger for just getting the word out, but actually the before he started sharing the word about climate change, conservatives and liberals really were kind of in a similar level of understanding and awareness about climate change. And then you just see after like 10 years later, there's this huge gap, this huge polarization. So, things like environmental issues didn't used to be super polarized. It's only really more recently. And same with science. Science was not something that was really polarized at all until more recently. So understanding that people are seeing things through their own worldviews and the social communities that are around them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's always interesting to me. I believe even Nixon very early on had recognized that climate change was occurring and that it was something that we needed to deal with. But then that got totally lost in a political message. And
Right.
so Jacqueline asks, how do you deal with the frustrations of people just not caring about important scientific facts while there are extremely pressing issues, climate change, or as an example?
Yeah. So I'm just trying to read this, the frustration of people. So do you mean that people are I'm just wondering. So I think that means that like we might feel frustrated, right?
I
Okay. Yeah. So I think I think what helps me is actually doing, and this kind of is answering, I think, Kevin's question, which is the next about learning what I learned while writing my book. I think being curious, right? Like being a social scientist means not assuming that you know why people think the way they do, but being curious enough to kind of wonder about it, right? So instead of being like, oh, they're just idiots, or, you know, they don't care about others, or whatever, you know, viewpoints we might have about the other side, which I'm sure we all have. It's especially now in such polarized times. Um, Starting to have a little bit of like, well, maybe they didn't have the same experience as me that I did. Maybe they didn't have the opportunity to, you know, maybe their family wasn't like engaged with, you know, talking about the news, or there could be so many reasons. But basically, like, that's why I like to share the example of the dress, because we literally see things differently based on our prior life experiences, right? So we can't know how people have come to the conclusions they've come to until we've walked in their shoes. And obviously we can't do that. So the next best thing is to try to have some openness to being curious about how they came to then ask questions. And actually, when you have questions, when you come to people asking questions and asking them like, well, why do you believe that? Like, how did you come to that? You learn a lot. You're like, oh, okay, that, you know, maybe, I mean, you might still just strongly disagree with their conclusions, but it's interesting to see how people come to their conclusions based on their prior life experiences. So that's how I deal with frustration. I'm not saying I'm always successful. You know, we're all human and we all get upset when people don't share our beliefs about certain things, especially things that we think are really, really important for the world, right? And so it's natural to have those feelings. But I think it's good sometimes if you are having those feelings and you're in a conversation, being like, I'm going to come back to this conversation another time, just kind of, and then try to think about how you might ask questions that would kind of get a better understanding. Yeah, because that's the first step before you're going to try to convince anyone. Well, first of all, you're probably not. There's like a very slim chance that you can convince people once they've made up their mind. Um, but what you can do is you can create experiences, shared experiences. So, for example, like if I had an aunt who was, you know, didn't believe in climate change and would bring it up at Thanksgiving, it wouldn't really make sense for me to kind of debate her over a Thanksgiving dinner about climate change. But I could say, hey, you know, I'd love to spend time with you. Like, can we go to the park, and or can we, you know, I'm part of this environmental group. Like, could you want to come like do like a shore cleanup? I don't know. I mean, maybe that wouldn't be an easy sell, but probably visiting a park and having a conversation with her, and just so she might have like an opportunity to be part of a different social group. Yeah.
I think that what you answered here also covered Christian's second question as well, but isn't it difficult when you're having a conversation with somebody and they make a statement that triggers you? And
Mhm.
we know that there are a number of words that may trigger one person or another. And you're sitting there going, okay, I started listening, but now I've stopped because I'm thinking about my rebuttal to what you just said and how I'm going to convince you that you're an idiot.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah, and it doesn't work. So
it
just
doesn't work.
knowing that it's not going to work to rebut, and you're just going to get into a debate with the other person digging in their heels. You know, it depends. If you're like the expert in the world on this particular topic and you can really hold your own, then yeah, maybe give it a try. But generally speaking, it's more effective to actually kind of they call it more tactical persuasion. So looking at how you could understand where someone's coming from and try to get them to explain their own reasons in a way that might kind of you know, be like, well, are you 100% sure about that? And pretty much no one is going to say 100% sure. If they do, then, you know, just give up. But if they say, well, 99%, well, what's the 1%? You know, and actually there's a whole tactic you can use that in that one book that I mentioned, How Minds Change, and he goes into the kind of step-by-step script that you might use to have a conversation like that. Yeah.
It's really interesting to me because thinking about this from more of a paleontology or anthropology point of view, that what has made us so successful as a species is communications and being able to tell stories. And I
Yeah.
think that maybe, we learned a lot as we went along from hearing from our grandmothers or our grandparents about, this is the way it is, and this is how the world is. And here are things that you learn how to do to live in your life. Uh, and so I think that in many cases, we probably find in communications, just like you've done, stories are a
Mhm.
great way to pass on information, or
Right.
to even give somebody a chance to think about what the story may mean to them. And then the fact that we need to listen a lot more.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
I actually have a question. So some of our community work that we do, we do some similar things that you mentioned too, right? Trying to really listen and ask questions of people in some of the communities that we're really focused on. And certainly in the examples you gave, they can be quite resource intensive. So do you have strategies or recommendations of effective, ways to create broader impact, or is it really a lot of this very deep, meaningful one-on-one time with people?
Yeah, I mean, that question I think comes up every time I give a talk and every time I say, I'm sorry, but there's no shortcut. Because yeah, I mean, sure, you can, you can create better messaging, more strategic messaging, but really what needs to happen is these more person to person, like the effort in India. I mean, it required a huge mobilization of civil society people going door to door again and again. But the success is just mind blowing. So like, yes, it's going to require investment. And I'm hoping that, so I know that you're like a locally based organization, but there are so many locally based organizations around the country. If every single one of those organizations was doing in-person engagement, like that would be the revolution, right? If maybe not every scientist, because I think there's some scientists who should stay in their labs, but but if there are, scientists who do like to be more public facing and have conversations and can do it in a respectful way, um, I think if every one of those could do like one event a year, go to public library, just set up. I mean, I've literally done tabling at a subway stop, like literally. It's all you need is a table and some stickers and, just show up and you could have conversations with people. And people always come by and they're curious, they have questions. So I do think we need an army of people and organizations using these approaches. So it's the majority. And right now, I think what the majority of organizations are doing is broadcasting these messages on social media. And it's just preaching to the choir. It's not reaching who we need to reach. So we need to try something different. Yeah.
And to follow up on Shannon's question and your response, what does this suggest about how scientists should be educated?
Yeah, well, I think they need some social science education. I think there's this misunderstanding that communication is persuasion, and that's not what communication is. It's like if you think about communicating with anyone, a family member, a partner, you don't give them a PowerPoint presentation. Like try to talk to your teenager about they're cleaning up their room with like a one pager, right? Like you have to sit down and have a conversation with them. And I don't know why, for some reason, science communication is different. It's not. It still needs to be two-way. So just that basic understanding that communication as a starting place is two-way. I mean, sure, you could diffuse, you could share messages, but that's not really communication. So if you wanted, so we need to rethink, we need to retrain and have more, I think, social science, just basic understanding of human behavior. Like some of the stuff I've been presented was, the research is like 60 years old. It's not new, a lot of this. This is basic behavioral, evolutionary biology mixed with behavioral science that it's like 101 stuff that I think could be fit into a very intro science communication class. Yeah. So that's my hope. My hope is that it will change. Yeah. But I don't know. I think a lot of science communications classes are still taught in this way of, elevator pitches, crafting your message, and that's fine. That could be part of it, but it can't be the whole thing, right? So yeah, I do think there's just a need and a shift in education a little bit. Not a ton. I mean, there's so much content that we need to learn, but maybe just one social science class. Right?
Well, to me, it sounds like what we need is One Health, that
Yeah, or
a
what else? Yeah, like
transdisciplinary approach,
yeah.
uh, to actually listen to other people with different points of view and bringing to bear uh, thoughts and expertise to solve all these very complex problems that we have in our communities and well beyond them.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, thank you so much for a great presentation. Thank you so much, Heritage Conservancy, for being our co-sponsor this evening. And everyone, again, I would say this is a great book. Please do go and pick up a copy. Island Press has very generously offered to give a 30% discount on this if you just use the discount code webinar. I hope everybody has a great evening, and I hope you'll join us in the future for One Health seminars. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.